also lived and traveled in China for 2 years and in Eastern Europe for 1 year. He currently lectures on international cultures at schools, universities, and institutions in the Boston area. Please welcome Barry Pell.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be back here. Connie, thank you very much for that introduction. I am a world traveler and photojournalist, and as Connie indicated, during the past 40 years, I've had such an opportunity and privilege to travel around the world. And when I travel, my interests are the kinds of interests that you would have, things like history and architecture and culture. But even more than that, what I aim to do from my travels is to promote awareness, to promote awareness and understanding among people. When I go to foreign countries, I feel that in a small way, I'm an ambassador of America. And I try to present an image of Americans that might be a little different than the things they see in the movies about Rambo and things like that, or things that they see in our political system where there's a lot of turmoil. And I try to present a different image of Americans and what America is all about. And then when I come back to the United States, of course, I present before groups like yourself. And I try to also present perhaps a different image, focusing mostly on developing nations of the world, where perhaps there are some misconceptions about the lifestyle in those countries. After all, when we see the news about developing countries, mostly we see things about famines and natural disasters and horrible health epidemics, things like that. And so I try to show that indeed, although those things do happen, that there's another side of life in developing countries where people express joy and indeed live very full lives and very wonderful, exciting lives, just the way some do here in America. So I try to provide a little bit of balance. Now, today's program is on China, and I have traveled in China quite a bit, and as Connie mentioned in the introduction, I lived there for 2 years. China is experiencing enormous change. The title of this presentation is Rapid Changes in an Ancient Land. And almost from week to week, there is an abundance of change going on. And yet, if you speak with Chinese people, they will still tell you that they feel theirs is a developing country, not necessarily a developed country. And at least when I was there in the mid-2000s, they said, well, probably it'll take about another 50 years, 50 years, for China to catch up with the United States. I'm not sure about that. It seems to me that they're a lot closer than 50 years. They are now, I think, the second largest economy in the world. Although there is a lot of disparity in China between the areas that have been developing fast, the showcase cities of places like Beijing and Shanghai on the coast, and the cities that are interior to the country, which have not had the kind of investment and improved urban design and architectural investment that has been experienced in the large cities on the coast. But so much, I've been thinking about the things that have happened that have made the news in China just over the last couple of years, and they've spanned a range of the most horrible things to the most wonderful things. You may recall there was the repression that was done for the Tibetan monks a couple of years ago, where the monks rebelled against violations of human rights, and the Chinese police came in, the army came in, and put that rebellion down rather brutally. There was the milk contamination scare, where someone was putting something in milk that was killing people, young children particularly. There was the toy scare, where they were putting a certain paint on toys that was toxic and then shipping it to the United States. There was, of course, the earthquake in Chengdu, in Sichuan, that killed some 300,000 people and left over 1 million people homeless. And that was a terrible time in China. But then, of course, there have also been some wonderful things. The Olympics that were held in 2008, which were an unqualified success. And you know, in Chinese culture, the number 8, which is ba in Chinese, is considered lucky. And so their Olympics, you may know this little fact, their Olympics was slated to begin on August, the 8th month, 8th, in 2008, and it began at exactly 8 p.m. and 8 seconds. So 8 they're somewhat superstitious people about things, but in fact the Olympics went off very well. So obviously that reinforced the success of using this number 8. And then recently they had the Shanghai Expo, which was an exposition of the latest and greatest industrial technology, and that was a rousing success and drew millions of people into Shanghai. So China has been on both sides of the coin in terms of doing incredible things that have built up their reputation and their technology, while also experiencing what you might consider to be growing pains. So, what I want to do is begin. Yeah, let's begin with the slides. I'll give you a little more background as I show you a map. All right, so here's our subject. And China, by the way, I can still see you in the audience. How many of you have been to China? Just to give an idea. All right, about a handful of you. Great. Okay. Well, China's a big place. It is about as big as the United States. And the major cities, the city of Nanjing, Shanghai, Beijing, the capital, are basically along the East Coast. And as you can see from the map, there is a concentration of the cities along the East Coast. You know, one of the facts that, use the mic. One of the facts that I find incredible about China is that in the United States, we have about 7 cities that are over 1 million population. In China, there are 171 cities that are over 1 million population. Quite an amazing contrast. And a lot of that population, that 1.3 billion people, are focused in the eastern half of the country. There are big, wide open spaces, as well as some pretty daunting mountain ranges and deserts along the western area. But also a lot of minorities here. And I actually lived in Beijing for a year, and then I lived down in the southwest of China in right down over here, in Kunming, which is the capital of Sichuan province. And I also traveled extensively in some of the 15 of the 26 provinces, as well as some what they call autonomous regions, semi-autonomous regions like Tibet and Xinjiang in the western part of the country. Whenever I traveled in China, as I always do when I travel around the world, I travel independently, not part of a group, and I visit not just the tourist sites, but the quieter, untouristed places, which I feel encourage people to engage me and to start friendships with me on a one-to-one basis. I had studied Mandarin for 3 years, and so although Chinese is a very difficult language, I didn't speak it fluently, it was certainly enough to establish some rapport with people. I found that many Chinese, especially in smaller towns and rural areas, are actually shy about meeting foreigners. But it was certainly a lot easier to meet them as an individual rather than appearing as a large group, which would be more intimidating to an individual Chinese person approaching such a group. And I also traveled by public transport. China has a very extensive public transport system of buses and trains, and I obviously also walked quite a bit. rather than renting a vehicle which I felt would seclude me and make it harder for me to meet people. Language, though, certainly in the remote areas, in the western areas of the country, was a significant barrier. And I was surprised that even in some of the larger cities, that not a whole lot of people spoke much English. Also, if they, in addition to speaking Mandarin, which is the main language, a lot of people speak dialect. There are dozens of different dialects, so just learning Mandarin often wasn't enough if I wanted to communicate with local Chinese people. In most cases, though, the language barrier did not prevent me from getting to know China, and the Chinese people. Many people I met were very interested to learn English, and they would often invite me to have a cup of tea in exchange for an informal English lesson in a tea house. Now, many Chinese have learned some grammatical or written English in school, but they're very shy about speaking. They feel that they're not speaking properly. But they like to try it out, but they get embarrassed easily. And so I recall one very telling situation where I was out on my day off. I taught English in China, and I was out in the park on a Sunday, and all of a sudden I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around, and there was a young man standing there, and he was all dressed in a suit and tie and very formal posture, stiff posture, and before I could even say anything, he looked me straight in the face, and he said, "Please give my best regards to your mother and father." And then he turned and ran away. He just wanted to practice how that sounded, and whether, but he was a little too embarrassed to stick around for the reception and what the review, what kind of rating I would give him on that. And this, I think, is fairly representative of the Chinese personality, where they really do want to try hard, but they are a little bit afraid of being caught up making mistakes. So my talk today is entitled China, Rapid Changes in an Ancient Land, and it's based on my experiences and personal impressions, and hopefully will also give you a photographic taste of the beauty of the landscapes of China, and also especially its people. Now, China is a beautiful land with a history of over 5,000 years. Similar to the United States, it is a large country with a range of topographic and landscape variations in many different climatic zones. In size, it is about the same as the United States, but with nearly 4 times the population. And as I say, the population is concentrated mostly in the east and along the coasts. In such a vast country, the waterways, as we look here at Shanghai and the Huangpo River along the coastal area of Shanghai, the waterways have taken on a central role as communication and trading links. There are beautiful natural landscapes as well, and a large variety of plants and trees. Bamboo, of course, is probably the most well-known plant associated with China, but there are also many other types of flowering foliage, and I was fortunate to have been traveling when many of the flowering trees and flowers were in bloom, including magnolia and pear and the cherry blossom. Now, China's long history enabled it to accomplish a highly advanced civilization and skilled culture in the man-made environment, including the applied arts like pottery and porcelain, bronze and jade, silk weaving, architecture, furniture, cooking arts, and music and theater. An example of many of these skills is shown here in the 2,000-year-old army of 6,000 life-size terracotta warriors and their horses, which are arranged in battle formation, serving as an imperial necropolis. And this was discovered only as recently as 1974, when some farmers were digging for a well in central China, the city of Xi'an. I'm sure those of you who have been to China have seen this wonderful place. One of the most impressive expressions of China's skilled culture is in its architecture. Dating back over 2,000 years was the beginning of a Chinese national architecture expressed first in an imperial style, in palaces for the emperors as a sign of national greatness. And these enormous constructions, such as the Forbidden City in Beijing and the Summer Palace, contained hundreds of rooms and were forbidden to and off limits to enter by common citizens. So, therefore, the name the Forbidden City. In succeeding centuries, distinctive Chinese styles were developed in gardens and pavilions, in landscape design, using many natural elements, some somewhat whimsical, in architectural facades, in interior design, and in furniture, all of which were raised to a very high art form. Now, in architecture for the common people, in addition to imperial architecture, also public building design embodied elegance of style, shape, decoration, and materials, such as this 200-year-old tea house in Kunming. Over 90% of the Chinese people belong to one ethnic group, the Han Chinese, but there are over 36 minority nationalities with their distinctive culture, including their architecture, such as this very colorful and elaborately carved Dai minority house, and this wooden covered bridge entering a Yao village, all of which fit so well and complement the surrounding landscape. Now, in religious buildings as well, pagodas, which were built around the 1st century AD, and Buddhist temples, starting with these cave temples in the 4th century, and remote monasteries, such as the Yuan Kong Si, or the Hanging Monastery, clinging rather precariously to sheer cliffs above a deep canyon. These evolved into a uniquely Chinese architectural religious motif and a very sacred and suitable form of expression to honor the Buddha. Public construction projects, like this city wall in Chufu, were often massive, and that was done not only to protect the townspeople, but also for the emperor to demonstrate power and greatness. There was also great pride and accountability in construction. This brick is from the city wall in Nanjing, and a little difficult to see, but down here, embossed on the brick, is the manufacturer's seal. And so if any of the bricks broke in this wall, clearly there would be trouble for the manufacturer, who could be instantly identified and punished. Would that not be a good system for the United States?
Yeah.
Engineering projects such as the Great Wall from 2,000 years ago helped protect China from invasion. And the Grand Canal in eastern China enabled the country to develop trade and economic prosperity. And more often than not, these constructions, although serving a practical purpose, I think you can see, were also rather beautiful, as well as functional, and harmonized with nature. Whether it was a small stone bridge crossing a stream, a river bridge with stepped Chinese roofline, a graceful arching viaduct, or a very handsome entry gate in Beijing with its elegant painted wood carved lintels. In such an environment of magnificent imperial palaces and elegant homes and gardens and inspiring temples, as well as attractive communal commercial buildings, and beautiful as well as useful bridges, canals, and other public infrastructure, a rich, prosperous, and literate civilization was able to thrive and advance. The environment was conducive to enhancing sociable and friendly people who developed games such as mahjong and pastimes, including the very popular birding. Ceremonial and social traditions, such as ballroom dancing lessons in the park, fan dance exercises, lion dancing, which is a part of the culture of southern China, especially for holidays and special occasions such as this dedication of a newly opening store, and cultural performances in communal settings. China is a very communal place, as well as high forms of artistic expression, such as the Chinese opera, which some people have described as the sound of chalk scraping on blackboard, but I actually kind of liked it. Music, and of course, sports. Traditionally, ping pong, but now very fast rising in China is the sport of basketball, with stars such as Yao Ming playing in the United States, and the average height of Chinese has been amazingly improving with their better diets, healthier diets, and also, I might add, perhaps in part, responsible for this is a shift to meat, as of course they've gotten wealthier, so they can afford to eat meat with all its protein, so the average height of Chinese young people is growing, and also the spreading of McDonald's and other fast food chains with their meat menus. And in fact, China has had to revisit their architectural standards because of it, in terms of the height of doorways and floor-to-floor spacing. Perhaps more than anything else, food is such an important part of Chinese culture as we look at these rice fields from the air. It's cultivation. Here are different rice varieties. It's preparation, which is found nearly everywhere, indoors and out. And, of course, eating is probably the most popular social activity that brings people together. And China's culinary skills and tradition of sharing and group eating was perhaps its major accomplishment. The very language of Mandarin itself elevates eating to great importance, with the traditional greeting, 你吃饭了吗, meaning, have you eaten yet? And this is how people greet each other in the street or if someone comes to your house. And I might note that China's challenge to feed its more than 1.3 billion people has encouraged very creative and intelligent application of rice growing techniques, such as terracing, to make use of as much land as possible.
Oh my gosh, look at that.
And has influenced the development of towns as well, where towns will cluster their housing, even in very rural, remote areas, in tightly spaced separation, tightly spaced areas, so that they have as much land as possible for their arable fields. Now, everywhere I went in China, I saw examples of strong families. 3 or 4 generations, grandparents often with their grandchildren, because the middle generation is working now, both mother and father, 2 breadwinner families. And seeing these grandfathers and their grandchildren was very endearing. Okay, I'm going to just change the slides.
Well, yeah.
It's just being
Now, in urban areas, the social fabric seemed to me to be best exemplified in the alleyway hutongs, where small shops mix with living quarters. And these hutongs are rapidly disappearing as China modernizes. In the hutongs, there's a rich texture of daily life, of socializing neighbors and playing children. It is a very outdoor type of lifestyle. And the outdoor life is enhanced, or it's promoted, by the fact that for much of the year, especially if you're south of Beijing, the weather is conducive to living outside. Also, they're hardy people. And also, living space inside is fairly limited and constrained with some large families. And so there's a freedom of being able to move about by being outside. And so that's why this has promoted communal living out of doors. And wherever I went, I nearly always got a smile and often an invitation to visit and to have some tea. Now, for many centuries, China was officially closed to the outside world, and it required a revolution to overhaul Chinese society. I particularly like this picture of the girl on her tricycle with the American flag logo on the handlebars.
Oh, it is too.
And that revolution, of course, was led by Mao Zedong to bring China's entry into the modern world, a path which future leaders would, of course, accelerate. Now, Mao, you know, is revered tremendously in China as the father of modern China, as he should be. But it was very, you know, there are many encounters when you live in a place that you have opportunity to see, and it lends a certain understanding to the culture that you wouldn't have if you were just visiting or traveling through the country. And one of those I mentioned about the language and the young man who approached me on a Sunday afternoon. Another one had to do with this image of Mao. And when I first was getting to know people in China, and I felt comfortable enough to question them about Mao, I said, well, really now, what do you think of Mao? Because clearly he did enormous things to progress the country into modern society, but he also had a lot of abuses that created the Cultural Revolution, great famines, things like that. And so when I got to know some people, and I would ask a Chinese person, well, what do you think about Mao? One person, the first person I asked this of, said, well, and seemed to be very thoughtful about it, like they were really just considering it now. They said, well, you know, I think that probably Mao did, I'd say 70% of the things he did were good, and probably 30% weren't so good. And I thought about that, and I thought, okay, maybe that could be about right. And then a couple of months passed, and I met somebody else, and I said, what do you think about Mao? And they said, well, let's see. I think probably 70% of the things he did were good, and 30% weren't, not so good. Now, after I heard this line about 5 or 6 times, I began to realize that that was the official line. And this is very indicative of China, Chinese mentality, and the kind of lockstep philosophy that people are fed and therefore embrace. There isn't a lot of independent thinking, particularly when it comes to more controversial topics. Now, during my travels, I saw the recent and ongoing evidence of the very fast modernization process happening in road construction, in bridges, in dams, especially, as you're all familiar, the Three Gorges Dam, which is the world's largest public construction project, even bigger than the Big Dig. Modern cities with high-rise skyscrapers. This is that new area of Shanghai called the Pudong District across the Huangpu River. There were appealing large public spaces like the People's Square in Shanghai. Modern shopping malls like this one in Beijing. Train stations like this beautiful train station, which has been given, the West Train Station in Beijing, which has been given a very Chinese motif. And places where people have space to dance or to exercise. There are a lot of these elderly exercise grounds around the cities, the major cities, or just stroll and socialize in cities like Hangzhou and Nanjing. I also saw well-designed bicycle travel lanes off the street, protected from motor vehicle traffic, and modern high-capacity public transit systems which exist now in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. But I was also amazed at the pace of new construction. You could pretty much see a building going up right before your eyes and come back the next day, and if they would be clearing the scaffolding, it would be done. It is 24/7 construction there with a beehive of workers. I realized that the showcase amenities that I visited in a few of the very largest cities generally did not extend to smaller or more remote cities and towns. I saw instead cities like Chongqing in the interior of the country, and many others, where my ferry boat stopped along the Yangtze River that had sprung up so rapidly that they appeared to be a jumbled confusion of ugly, high-rise buildings of drab materials and colors that had no relationship to each other or to their hillside environment. The scenery along the Yangtze is beautiful, so encountering these poorly planned and designed cities where people live was shocking. When I walked through these places, I found them to be unattractive and unappealing. Even the people who live there seemed depressed by their daily surroundings. And there were no public spaces or parks in those interior non-showcase towns to relieve this oppressiveness. Only immense buildings, narrow sidewalks, and glittery plazas of store after store with large, ugly signs for shopping and eating. In many towns and cities, I saw construction of new streets and highways destroying old neighborhoods. There is no environmental impact process, where the only memory left was a pile of salvaged bricks, perhaps to be reused. The hutongs and their ancient way of life are being rapidly torn down, which certainly may have certain benefits because in certain cases, most cases, they don't have indoor plumbing. But what is replacing them is often built on such a large scale that it has lost a comfortable human feeling. It seemed to me that the bigger and more massive the project, the more it was promoted on huge billboard advertisements. Of course, a country cannot be great on a piece of paper if the quality of life of the people is diminished. In this billboard for a new development, which clearly would soon rise from this site, there's no longer a place for the fruit and vegetable sellers who make their living here every day. The scale, out of proportion for human comfort, has extended to the transportation system too, where massive roads of 8 to 12 lanes wide make it virtually impossible and dangerous for pedestrians and bicycles to cross. There is no beauty in these gigantic flat boulevards or elevated highways which stab through the cities, dividing them up. In China, the car has become king, taking priority over pedestrians and bicycles. New building design encourages access by driving instead of walking, and the inevitable result has been severe traffic congestion and horrible pollution, turning the air into a frightening-looking haze. And another small story indicative of the Chinese mentality and philosophy. And I don't say these as criticisms, it's simply a way of divulging to you a little bit of the Chinese ethic. And that is that one of the times I lived in China was when they were applying for the Olympics in 2001. And of course, the Olympic Committee comes to each of the cities to check it out and see whether they are worthy of hosting the Olympics. Now, China has some pretty bad pollution. Beijing in particular, like in this photo, has horrible pollution most of the time. But before the Olympic Committee was about to arrive, the week before, and this was in the winter that they were coming, China put out an edict to all homes, all residences, and all industry that they should stop heating their homes, stop building anything, not produce any pollution. And so the entire city was quiet, people didn't drive, nothing happened for a week. When the Olympic Committee arrived, the air was pristine. Things were beautiful. The Olympic Committee had their checklist. Air quality, check, great, terrific. They left, everything went back to normal.
Oh my God.
That's the way Chinese, and because China is a controlled society, they can get away with that. They can insist upon it because all the people are lockstep behind them to support these kinds of things, which they feel will progress and enhance the country's development and their future. Okay. I also saw many barges on the rivers delivering coal. Coal is still the major energy source for the country and heating source. Of course, it is a major source of pollution. The Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River is impressive and fueling a lot of the electricity for the country's needs. But I wondered about the hundreds of thousands of relocated people, their whole social structure destroyed when entire towns and villages were submerged underwater, which has already happened, and how future generations will never see and know the full beauty of the Three Gorges, since the water level rose some 300 feet in the gorge. In many of the cities, there's not enough room set aside for bicycles, and this has a snowballing effect because bicycles extend onto the sidewalk. There's no room for pedestrians. Pedestrians then have to walk in the street, and people don't have enough open green space, and therefore they have to use the sidewalk for some of their exercises, getting in the way of pedestrians. And with the country's growing prosperity, more people are able to travel. Now that's a good thing, but at train stations like this one in Guangzhou, especially during national holiday periods, there's not enough room inside the station for passengers who find it therefore more comfortable to sit on the ground outside the station. Now with its vast size, China benefited early on from a controlled political and economic system to organize its massive labor population, including large farm cooperatives. And that was necessary in the early days of the new China. With great need, most critically to feed their large population and limited help from the outside world. You recall, of course, that after World War II, Europe had the Marshall Plan to help them rebuild. Nobody helped China rebuild. And so they had to do it themselves, and the communist system was embraced as the way to accomplish that. The communist system emphasized the practical and utilitarian rather than the aesthetic. Artistic expression during those early days of communism was viewed as frivolous and receded in the public vernacular. This was in sharp contrast to what had historically been an intrinsic part of China's culture, which had always been characterized by beautiful as well as functional design, but now was frequently expressed by bland concrete and white tile facades on square, boxy buildings. Good planning, of course, cannot occur at such a frantic pace, and one of the negative results of inadequate facilities for people to safely and calmly manage their daily transport, work, and recreational lives has been a loss of politeness and basic civility in parts of China, a decline in what Confucius once described, talking about China, referring to it as the land of manners. This seemed to have been lost. Now, I don't believe, pessimistically, I do not believe, I'm an optimist about China, and I don't think China has permanently abandoned its aesthetic traditions, as China's system has moved towards a capitalist private economy and relaxed some of the strictures of a totalitarian government. Cultural freedoms are returning. slowly, to express themselves in art and architecture. This is already happening in the big showcase cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where China's wealth has enabled it to commission some of the world's leading architects. So, what were my overall and lasting impressions of China? I was certainly impressed by a great country in a beautiful and historic land, and people who, for the most part, love their country very deeply, are very hardworking, and are optimistic about their future. The greatest resource of any country is its people. China is a country with some deep religious beliefs and strong devotion to family. It is also a country with tremendous potential and the desire to be better. From my travels, I believe that at least 6 goals will be essential for them to develop. The first is education, and this is one of my classes in Beijing. Not only formal education in schools for necessary skills, but opportunities for more people to visit other parts of China and the world, to develop an awareness, an understanding, an appreciation of other cultures, customs, ways of thinking, and different opinions. China had been among the most isolated historically. And also an uncensored press freedom. You know, another little story I could tell you is that when I was in China in 2001, and I went, you know, the big magazines, the Western magazines at that time, like Time magazine and Newsweek, were not available in normal Chinese newsstands. They certainly weren't printed in Chinese, so would have had little utility for Chinese people. But in the big hotels, the Western hotels, they did have Time magazine, for example. But when you would look at Time magazine in 2001, and you would come to an article in the magazine that was critical of China in any way, you would see a big hole cut in the page. That would be scissored out, would be cut out. It wouldn't be there. When I returned in 2005, Time magazine was still there, but the critical articles about China, of which there still were not removed. So, this is small progresses that one sees as the country is relaxing some of their censorship and feeling more comfortable about their position in the world. The second thing that needs to be done is to take care of their environment. And all over China, there are signs like this: take good care of public health, keep the garden clean and tidy. A lot of sentiment about the environment, but not a lot of action. Lots of words, but not too much action. And this attendance to a better environment, I think, needs to be emphasized, even if it means slowing economic growth. And there was quite a debate in China about the pros and cons of a slower economic growth so that to take care of the environment better. They need to develop adequate and usable green spaces and conduct more widespread government campaigns, including what I saw small efforts, although now they have expanded in the large cities, for recycling, and also enforcing laws against littering, smoking, and vehicle emissions. It's still very common when Chinese people go by ferry boat along the Yangtze to throw cans of soda or cigarette cartons, packets overboard when they've finished with them. And to address other polluters, as well as making the environment accessible to all, which they have really not addressed any of the kinds of things we've done in our architectural standards for people with disabilities. Third is the treatment of minority groups. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are over 36 minority nationalities representing about 100 million people sprinkled across the country, but mostly in the west and southwest, in Yunnan province, where I was living the second time I lived there. These people have their own distinctive language, dress, food, customs, religion, and culture. And they dress up with their native costumes on a daily basis, not just for special events. When they go shopping to the market, they dress in their native costume, which was wonderful to get to know them, to distinguish them, and to see what those beautiful customs were about. They make them all themselves. There are the Yao people that I just showed you, the Dai people shown here, the Nashi people, the Jingpo people. This is a Hani girl. And of course, Tibetans in the semi-autonomous region of southwestern China, with their very separate practices of Tibetan Buddhism. These are women in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet province. And the Uyghur people of Xinjiang, westernmost China, who are Central Asian and who observe the Muslim religion. And as you, I'm sure, read, there has been a lot of friction with separatist movements in the Xinjiang area with the Muslims who have been very violently attacked by the Chinese army. The peace and growth of China and its image in the eyes of the world will depend on the freedom and human rights accorded these groups to sustain their culture and religious practices. And of course, most recently, we have this, the gentleman who was just awarded the Nobel Prize, who is unable to get his Nobel Prize because he is in a Chinese prison for being a dissident trying to fight for human rights and democratization in China. And this has been quite publicized. Fourth, although China's laws are slowly changing, there is an absence yet of strong patent and copyright protections and their enforcement, which results in copycat stores, almost comical, like You Like Coffee, with its logo and interior signs and furniture copied to imitate Starbucks. Or the Mikey sporting goods store, with its nearly identical resemblance to the Nike swoosh. Without the assured protection of intellectual property, economic investment and development in China will be restrained. The fifth is addressing the growing gap between the living standards of people in the countryside and in the much more economically prospering cities. China's economy has been growing at an impressive rate of some 10% annually, even while the world has been going through an economic recession. And this has been going on for about 20 years. But this growth has nearly exclusively helped people in the big cities, while the remaining 2/3 of the population, the so-called peasants, have seen their income remain the same or even drop, so that now nearly 1/2 of the country's wealth is in the hands of 10% of the population. And sixth is population control. That is, continuation of their one-child policy, which will improve the quality of life for everyone and will make all the other goals easier to accomplish. And the one-child policy, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically, as it sounds, says that families can only have one child in order to keep their population growth rate down, or actually reduce some of their population. This plan has been successful. Over the last 25 years it's been enforced. There are lots of exceptions to it, such as the minority groups are allowed to have more than one child because a lot of them do work on the farm and need more labor. Also, it's caused a lot of social problems because when families can only have one child, you know they want to have a boy. And so there have been a lot of aborted girls, and the population differential between girls and boys has been growing, such that there are now millions, and they project that the population will be very uneven in the next generation. There will be many, many more men than there will be women in this population. Also, it makes a problem for taking care of parents, because when there's only one child in the family, and even if that child gets married and then there are 4 parents to take care of, this becomes a challenge when there are no siblings. And of course it means there'll be no aunts and uncles. So this is creating a lot of social strain in the Chinese population, and there has been sentiment to increase the number of exemptions. For example, if both people are professional, those people have a chance to have more than one child if they're in the professional part of the economy. One of my lasting impressions of China is, of course, the Great Wall, which to me represents the nation's greatness and its ability to successfully accomplish even the most challenging needs. I believe that if the goals I've described are pursued, that China will join the ranks of responsible world leaders as a developed nation. And the United States should look forward and will benefit mutually from that lasting partnership. Thank you very much.
How long is the Great Wall?
The Great Wall is 2,000 miles.
And the Grand Canal?
Oh, the Grand Canal, I think it's several hundred miles long. I don't think it's all that long. Yeah.
When I was there, and I'm thinking it was about 20 years ago, little babies wore diapers that split apart, and as they walked down the street, if they had to go to the bathroom, they just went. Is that still so?
Absolutely. Yeah, the comment is that when she was there, the babies, small toddlers, wore special pants that were open in the back so that rather than having diapers and things like that, which actually environmentally is probably better for the child, maybe not for the street, they would just hold them up and bend their legs and they would just go directly there. And that's still very, very common. Despite, that's some part of the incongruity of China, is that they've made all these modern advances, they have some of the most modern computer technology, but they still have some what we would consider old-fashioned or older ways of older practices that they've had for generations, and they adhere to them.
Are they still spitting as they walk down the street?
Well, yes. The other question is, are they still spitting? Hawking and spitting is a big part of Chinese culture. They are not doing it as much, although it shows there's a tremendous variance in this habit from the bigger cities where they have been acculturated more to Western ways, and also laws have been promulgated to prevent it and enforced, versus the countryside, the vast countryside, where these habits still continue as they have for generations and generations. Yes?
Is most of the industry on the eastern coast? I see the fields, for the peasants, but it doesn't show me that there's much outside of that immediate area.
Yeah, the question is most of the industry on the East Coast? Most of the industry is where the population centers are on the East Coast. There is growing industry in some of the larger interior cities, particularly those along the Yangtze River, where they're able to get transportation. But by and large, the population centers, the labor centers, the economic powerhouses, and the industrial factories are along the eastern part of the country, east and southeast, along the water.
So do the peasants send all the rice and everything into the cities? Is that?
That is correct. Yeah,
They get nothing for it?
Yep, all the fresh produce is sent into the cities, and then it's either it's disseminated there to it's bought there or disseminated there to smaller towns within the province, or it's sent east. But yes, and of course, more than sending the food to the cities, they're sending themselves to the cities, and there has been a tremendous migration of peasants from the cities, from the rural areas into the cities to do some of this round-the-clock construction, which has also created not only practical strains upon housing, but also social strains, because there's a great disparity between the culture of the urban dwellers and the peasants who have had no exposure to this. And there's a lot of people, many of the urban people stay away from and ridicule some of the peasants in their peasant outfits and their clothing that might even go back to Mao's time, and their poverty. So there's a disparity in income, there's a disparity in social class. Yes?
showed no agriculture that had meat products. Where do they get their meat?
Comment has to do with agriculture that involves meat. They get their meat from farm animals, which they have there. They have pigs and cows, and they do have a sizable amount. But meat, especially in the rural areas, meat is not as big a part of their diet because of money as it is in the Western world. Certainly, it's a much more vegetable-based diet. Yes.
What is happening with the one child per family? Is that sort of relaxing a bit? And what is happening about the disparity between males and kids and females?
I think I mentioned in the presentation, toward the end of the presentation, that there is, because of that one-child policy, there is a growing disparity by the millions, where in the next generation, in the generation that's coming of age now, there are many millions of more men than there are women, and this will create a real problem for maybe a boom for women, but a real problem for men looking for suitable mates. And this is a tremendous issue. Now, in the cities, again, this is a cultural and class issue, because in the cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where people have been acculturated to the West, there isn't the stigma anymore of just having a girl. There are lots of families that only have a girl. But in the rural areas, it is still considered the right thing to do. The only desire is to have, if they have to have one child, to have a boy. It's still considered the most prestigious thing that they can have. And so this is creating problems. And as I mentioned also, it's creating problems in terms of taking care of elderly parents when you have small families, and the fact that these growing family, these children will grow up without, their children will grow up without any aunts and uncles. And aunts and uncles are a big part of the culture in China. Yes?
All right, so we want to go to China, right?
Perfect, great. I'm glad I instilled that in.
Well, I've always wanted to do that. But how much of this are we going to get to see? I mean, we can't travel on our own, as you had the wonderful advantage of living there and having time to really travel and meet people and speak some language. I mean, we might learn to say hello or goodbye or something.
You certainly will still learn to say ni hao.
Okay.
Absolutely, you can still get tremendous amount out of it. And there are so many these days, so many tours, if that's your choice, that will take you to the highlights of China and still give you a wonderful entree into not only the big cities, but what life is like in the countryside, and you'll be able to travel and see some of the history and learn about the people. So, these are absolutely readily available through places like Overseas Adventure Travel, but not just them, dozens of agencies that you see advertised in the paper and on the internet that run tours of all sorts of anywhere from 10 days to months at a time, depending on your budget. That will take you that will take you to some of the highlight places like Beijing, Shanghai, Suzhou, where the canal is, Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are, and other places, depending on how much time you want to spend there. So it is absolutely accessible. And a lot of people who have been there some years back remember things like horrible hotels and bathrooms, poor transportation. That has changed enormously. And so if people tell you horror stories of what they might have experienced even a decade ago, that has changed in a wholesale way now, especially when they had the Olympics there. They've upgraded the infrastructure and the whole social condition for travelers in a marked way. So,
but it's still polluted, right?
there is still some pollution. Yeah, absolutely.
Are they trying to control the pollution even though they use so much coal?
Yeah, they are working to control pollution. They recognize that that's a great handicap, but it's a problem when you do depend on coal so much. Yes?
I expected to see pictures of their manufacturing plants and all this sort of thing. It seems like you can't buy anything unless it's made in
Yeah,
China.
where was it?
So where are they, and how are they getting their labor to do this kind of thing?
Well, the easy question, where they're getting the labor, they're all coming in off the farms. They have, there are 600 million people who are peasants, and
But that's gonna be a big problem also, isn't it? Making a transition from.
well, right, as I
peasant to-
mentioned, it's a big problem for
Machine operated.
housing, and it's a big problem for training and for
Yeah.
for social status, mixing in with the urban populations. But on the other hand, it's also a big asset, because the people who come in from the farms, who have a very poor standard of living, are willing to work for almost nothing and work on repetitive jobs for 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, living in dormitories. For them, it's a step up. And so that labor pool enables China to compete very well in the world market. There are clearly no unions. In terms of my photos, yeah, I mean, there are factories everywhere, and I would pass them, but number one, I didn't have access to those factories. Number two, that really wasn't my greatest interest, to go visiting factories where you would see dozens and dozens and dozens of, as long as you could see, of people sitting at stations putting widgets together.
Well, why isn't the United States making a big fuss about this? You know, we usually don't like countries that have slave labor, you know, and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's been a big issue in the United States.
Really?
The idea of sweatshops and well, these are sweatshops,
Yeah, that's
essentially.
what they are, right?
And I think that's been a big political issue. On the other hand, you know, it's been tamped down a bit because big business in the United States depends on that labor to keep products cheap. Because these are products that a lot of the companies, the Benettons of the world and the, you know, they're all having, the Nikes of the world, they're all having shoes and clothing and everything else made in these factories. So on the one hand, they speak out of one corner of their mouth against sweatshops and trying to impress upon the American public that they're looking after the welfare of the workers, but on the other hand, they like to get things pretty cheap. Yes?